So this paper's a bit like Philip Clayton's yesterday, in that it's quite big picture orientation. I'm trying to think through the different ways that one could draw the connection between panpsychism in philosophy of mind to theology or spiritualities of various sorts, and the different routes that could take. Sarah is always pushing me to consider the role of biography in theology, and Philip Goff did an excellent job at this, I think, in his recent book, Galileo's Error. So I thought I might try my hand at it here and start off with a few comments on my intellectual biography so that you can understand really where I'm coming from with this argument and this analysis. I discovered theology as a subject halfway through my undergraduate at the University of St Andrews, and ended up majoring in theology and modern history. And I did a dissertation on T.F. Torrance. I then went on to a master's program at Princeton Theological Seminary, where I worked with Bruce McCormack, and a PhD in Edinburgh, where I worked with David Ferguson. So I'm not name dropping here to sound impressive or anything. I'm trying to signal that my theological training is deep within a stream of post-Barthian, fairly reformed Anglo-American theology. Now, if theology is not your field and you don't really understand what I'm talking about here, I'll try and explain it or characterize it for you. The early 20th century theologian Karl Barth famously rejected, or claimed at least to reject, all forms of natural theology or analogia entis, the reasoning about God from what we learn in the natural world on the basis of some kind of analogy of being between the world and the being of God. Instead, Barth argued that Christian theology should always be thinking in response to what God has done and revealed of God's self in revelation. And for Christians, that revelation is not primarily the Bible or the church, but fundamentally Jesus Christ, to which hopefully the Bible and the church bear witness. So following the importation of this Barthian theology into North America via the Yale School and into the UK via the work of T.F. Torrance, generations of post-Barthian scholars see what Barth has said to be something of a turning point in theology, away from general trends of secularization or liberalizing impulse that characterize modernity. What this means, in theory, is that theology does not need to submit to the standards of rationality found in other disciplines, whether these be natural science or philosophy. Instead, theologians can, for good reasons of their own, have their own standards of argumentation and criteria. And it's in this kind of stream of theology that is my primary training and heritage. By declaring this, or disclaiming it almost, what I'm trying to say is that I'm something, sometimes at least, of an odd duck for both science and religion conversations and for panpsychist conversations. Indeed, I came to both fields, science and religion, broadly, and panpsychism more specifically at roughly the same time, encountering them both in my master's, and then going on to explore the revival of panpsychism within contemporary analytic philosophy in my PhD. So what this means is that I read Thomas Nagel, David Chalmers, Galen Strawson, and indeed Philip Goff and Goodhart Brunstrup long before I ever really heard of Alfred North Whitehead, Charles Harthorne, or David Ray Griffin. So it's perhaps no surprise then that my argument for the rest of this paper is in one sense quite simply that one does not have to take the route of process theology or even more broadly immanentist, panentheist or pantheist spiritualities as the only way to think theologically about panpsychism. Of course, one can take such routes, but the reasons for doing so will be, I think, external or at least additional to panpsychism itself. Panpsychism, it seems to me, is a far more flexible position vis-a-vis its implications for philosophy of religion or theology than has often been appreciated. But I also don't think it's entirely flexible or infinitely flexible. So to make this argument in a bit more substance, there'll be two main sections to the rest of this paper. First, I'll give a bit more detail as to how I understand panpsychism, or how this is mostly just to clarify that we're all on the same page, and to position panpsychism vis-a-vis other competing positions in philosophy of mind. Then in the second rest of the half of this paper, I'll compare two different routes that one can take for moving from panpsychism to theology. I think they're both credible, they're both open options to a theologian, but what I want to draw our attention to is that they give radically different pictures of God. As an aside, I just should clarify, I don't think these are the only two routes you can take. I can think of at least one more, at least a third, and I'd be really curious to see if anyone else can think of further routes, further ways to make this journey, as it were, from panpsychism to theology. But I'm just exploring and contrasting these two here. So first of all, what do I take panpsychism to be in its relationship to other competing positions? So panpsychism is a family of theories within philosophy of mind, which seek to explain the existence of consciousness in the human person by positing that mentality, psyche, is fundamental throughout the natural world, pan. To claim that mentality is fundamental is to say that the mind can neither be explained in terms of nor reduced to anything non-mental. So this is already in contrast to physicalists who claim that the mind can be reduced to the physical, or to what I call pure emergentists, who claim that minds can be explained by the behavior of or structure of non-mental materials or forces. Note that panpsychism does not entail that the only things that exist are mental or immaterial, although it's certainly compatible with this idealist interpretation. Strictly speaking, panpsychism comments only on the nature and place of mentality in the cosmos. And so importantly for me, it's not a totalizing or a complete ontological theory. It's just a theory about the mind. So while traditional substance dualists can also describe the mind as fundamental, most substance dualists envision minds as given to a particular organism upon conception or embryonic development by God or by some other extra force. Substance dualists do not typically describe mentality as fundamental throughout the natural world. However, I think one could construe panpsychism equally well as a kind of dualism all the way down, just as much as a kind of dual aspect monism. It's really just a matter of emphasis. When one compares panpsychism to neighboring positions within philosophy of mind, I think its closest relative seems to be hylomorphism. Hylomorphism is a position derived from Aristotelian philosophy, which sees all actual being as a combination of matter and form. Matter without form only exists in potentiality and is prime matter, whereas actual matter has form and is known as corporeal substance. And the form of a thing is what makes it the kind of thing that it is. And Aristotle referred to, therefore, the form as the soul or the psyche of a thing. The form of human beings is a rational soul, whereas the form of other animals is an irrational soul, and of plants is a vegetative soul, and so on. But just like panpsychists will often emphasize indwelling powers or a powers-based ontology, so in hylomorphism, there are active and passive powers of dispositions within any given thing, such that causation arises from the inherent capacities within informed matter. So both panpsychism and hylomorphism provide a basis for retaining a sense of teleology or final causes within the natural world. So how then do we differentiate panpsychism from hylomorphism? It seems that they share a great deal. Well, I suggest the best way to do this is that hylomorphism needs to give each substance its as fundamental in and of itself, so that there are fundamental entities at multiple levels of scale for the hylomorphist. By contrast, a panpsychist will suggest that fundamentality needs to be found at only one level of reality, and everything else in reality is an aggregate, a combination, or an individuation of that one fundamental level. In this sense, both hylomorphism and panpsychism uncomfortably straddle the categories of monism and dualism. Both extend a kind of duality to all of reality, both animate and inanimate. And so, as I kind of suggested earlier, it might turn out that the categories of monism and dualism and even idealism that we are used to talking about are rather unhelpful when we're trying to articulate these views. For while denying the reality of neither the mental or the material entirely, panpsychism often eschews these typical typologies by underlying that what we call mental and what we call material are always found together and cannot be separated. And this nicely fits with the kind of theological extension of panpsychism that I want to propose and would favor, because it already paves the way to saying something like all the divisions within the created world, particularly those between mind and matter, or between humanity and other creatures, are not really divisions at all, and pale in comparison to the first act of creation out of nothing, and one true division or distinction between a necessary creator and a contingent creation. And so this brings me to the second half of my paper of it contrasting two separate routes from panpsychism to theology. The first route is based on an analogy of being, or that infamous analogia entis that Karl Barth got so angry and upset about. Extending panpsychism into theology on the basis of an analogy of being has been, it seems to me, the most popular route so far. This argument would roughly say that the most fundamental level of mentality is the being of God. Eugene Nagasagwa has argued that if you go with an atomistic panpsychism, then this analogy will lead you to a polytheism. And if you go with a more cosmopsychist picture, then this would lead you to pantheism or panentheism, if these can be meaningfully differentiated, which I know is controversial and I don't think they can, but there we are. The basic idea here is that the mental is not only the core of reality, but it's also a kind of mystical core of reality, or put another way, that spirit is the final, ultimate, and unifying stratum of existence. So the assumption here, which we might know is common not only to panpsychists who take this route, but also to quite traditionally theistic substance dualists like J.P. Moreland and the like, is that God is a kind of big mind. That when we say God is immaterial and created minds are immaterial or not reducible to the physical, what this means is that God and minds are basically the same type of thing, or at least similar enough that we can make strong analogies. But this, of course, is misleading. Just because two things are not material doesn't mean that they are the same. It doesn't even mean that they're remotely similar. And so I think there's a kind of logical fallacy going on here, or at least an assumption that needs to be questioned. Instead, if one affirms with traditional Christian theology the doctrine of creation from nothing, then this places a strict ontological break between God as a necessary being and the world as contingent. And it means that there could still be a panpsychist world, but that this wouldn't tell us anything particularly interesting about the nature or the substance of the divine. If panpsychism is taken to be true, then it might tell us something about divine intentions for the creation, or perhaps the type of thing God values, but it doesn't tell us anything about God in the being of God. So my basic point is that panpsychism tells us far less about God than has often been assumed. For traditional Christian theologians, this argument can be taken as a kind of fear not. You can be a panpsychist and you don't have to change any of your basic theological commitments to things like divine aseity or various divine attributes or creation ex nihilo. And this route is what we've explored so far. I call the route by analogy of being, right? And it's helpful to name this and examine it because it shows that it is just one option. And there are other ways which one could take the route from panpsychism to theology. But as I've said, although this gives panpsychism a kind of flexibility, so you don't have to adopt pantheism or immanentist theologies, you can still affirm divine transcendence. I don't think it gives it a infinite or entire amount of flexibility. And the argument for this suggests a different kind of route from panpsychism to theology. Not one based on analogy of being, but instead one based on an extension of an argument or an extension of logic that the panpsychist has already often made, vis-a-vis getting to panpsychism in the first place. And this, I think, rules out, or at least should strongly resist, the combination of panpsychism with atheism. I almost surprise myself in this argument because I typically just think panpsychism is just flexible, but I actually think it's pretty difficult to be a panpsychist and an atheist. And so here's my argument for that, which shows us a different kind of route. And this argument has been developed a bit more fully in a recent response to Philip Goff's book, Galileo's Error, which will be coming out in the Journal of Consciousness Studies in the near future. So if you want to see some of the details, that's where you should go. So if pure emergentists argue that wholly non-experiential matter can give rise to consciousness, that consciousness is an emergent feature of a purely physical world, then the panpsychist needs to reject this or show this is why this is wrong in order to motivate their panpsychism. For a while, philosophers of mind were quite optimistic that pure emergentism might be true. However, one reason for the revival of panpsychism in recent analytic philosophy is that this kind of brute emergence or pure emergence is looking increasingly implausible. And this is the so-called genetic argument of panpsychism, or sometimes called the argument from non-emergence or the argument from origination. Simply put, this argument denies that mind or experience could ever emerge from something wholly non-experiencing. Consciousness cannot suddenly appear in the world in which nothing conscious previously existed, not even in a latent or potential form. And as Professor Bruntrup recently said just a few moments ago, something cannot give what it itself does not possess. Of course, Professor Bruntrup argues that emergence and panpsychism can be combined. You can be an emergent panpsychist, and I think this position is the one that's most likely to be true at the end of the day. But the panpsychist first needs to rule out pure emergentism in order to motivate this. The genetic argument is one which contemporary panpsychists must make, therefore, in order to avoid pure emergentism. But in making this argument, what panpsychists are doing is arguing for the existence of minds that we're not aware of, not directly. They can't be empirically detected. Then they don't have much strong analogical warrant because they're not very much like human minds. And the reason that a panpsychist posits that these minds exist in nature is on the basis of the principle that something cannot come from nothing, that experience cannot come from non-experience. So in making this argument, I think the panpsychist is committing herself to at least one of two explanatory principles. She either rejects the radical novelty of brute emergence because it violates the causal principle, according to which every contingent being has a cause for its existence, and that the perfection of effect is found in the cause. Or the panpsychist rejects pure emergence because pure emergence does not hold the principle of sufficient reason, which states that no fact can be real or existent, no statement true, unless there's a sufficient reason why it is so and not otherwise. And that's a quote from Leibniz. So it's because a panpsychist cannot abide the abandonment of the causal principle or the principle of sufficient reason, because these undergird all scientific and rationalist endeavors, that instead the panpsychist chooses to posit something seemingly counterintuitive and for which she often receives a lot of slack from her colleagues, namely that minds are fundamental to the universe. So as some of you might have worked out, one of the interesting things about these two principles is that they form the backbone of pretty much all of, or at least most of, the cosmological arguments for the existence of God. The Leibnizian cosmological argument from contingency on the basis of the principle of sufficient reason, and the cosmological argument from sustained existence, or the Kalam cosmological argument from temporal being, are both on the basis of the causal metaphysical principle. So these are a family of a posteriori arguments that infer a necessary and creative being, that which we all call God, from particular facts about the universe. Now, the cosmological argument has received lots of critiques, such as those put forward by David Hume and Immanuel Kant, but these critiques typically end up denying the causal principle or the principle of sufficient reason. So the panpsychists cannot follow Hume and Kant in making these critiques if they want to maintain the use of these principles against pure emergentism. So whereas the philosopher of religion asks, why is there something rather than nothing? And why is it like this? A philosopher of mind might ask, why are there experiencing somethings rather than no experiencing somethings? And why are these experiencing somethings as they are? Either there is an answer to these types of questions in terms of a reason or a pre-existing condition or a cause of some variety, or there's no answer to these questions. But I suggest that we should apply the same logic to both sets of questions, whether one is working in philosophy of religion or philosophy of mind. What the panpsychist does is to tie consciousness to the contingency of the whole universe. And in doing so, she makes consciousness no more surprising, but also no less surprising than the existence of the universe at large. The existence of space-time, of natural laws, of quantum vacuums, or for whatever it is that we take to be most fundamental in other senses. So whilst it's beyond the bound, I think, of the panpsychist as a philosopher of mind to explain the universe, it does still cry out for an explanation. The most parsimonious and consistent way for a panpsychist to do this would be to extend the same logic that she uses in philosophy of mind and apply it to the universe at large. So all I am suggesting is that panpsychists take their reasoning one step further and posit that there's a first cause or sufficient reason for the existence of a panpsychist universe. Just like she posits there must be a cause or a sufficient reason for the appearance of human minds within the universe. So in this argument that I've laid out for you, we have a different kind of example of how one might get from panpsychism to theology, and specifically how panpsychism might point towards the existence of God. I didn't just make this argument because it's, I think, an interesting argument to make, but also because it's an example of how a panpsychist might also be a theist or interested in theological questions without drawing upon an analogy of being, a kind of general similarity between fundamental consciousness in the universe and then divinity. In fact, the second route that I've drawn from panpsychism to theism demands that we maintain that God is radically transcendent, that God is something that could explain the existence of reality, that God is something that is not natural in the sense of being naturalistic, but in fact is the creator beyond all that does exist. So you get from these two different routes two very different pictures of God, but I think both are viable possibilities in moving from panpsychism to theology. Thank you.